Masechet Gittin, Daf Mem Bet. We're talking about a half-free and half-slave person, and we're discussing how can one come to be in such a situation. We saw that everyone agrees that if you have a partnership, two people own one slave and one frees him, then yeah, you're going to have a situation where he's half-free and half-slave, and the Mishnah taught, Tikkun Olam, we force the owner to free his half. The question is, however, what if it's one person that wholly owns a slave? Can he free half of the slave that he owns? And we saw yesterday a braita that quoted machloket between Rabbi Yehuda Nasi and Chachamim. Rabbi Yehuda Nasi said yes, an owner can free half a slave, and Chachamim say no, it does not work. On that, Rabbah is going to give a limitation. He already made one limitation yesterday regarding Ashtad versus Kesef, and now this is another limitation on that machloket. Amar Rabbah. מחלוקת בששחרר חציו והניח חציו, אבל שחרר חציו ומכר חציו, או נתן במתנה חציו, כיוון דנפיק מיני כולה, דברי הכל קנה. Rabbah said the מחלוקת between Rabbi Yehuda Nasi and Chachamim is only applies in a case where the owner frees half of the person and leaves half of the person as a slave to himself. And that's where Rabbi says, yes, it works, but Chachamim say, no, you cannot do that. However, if the owner fully gets rid of all of the parts of the slave, but he does it in pieces, so he frees half of him. Half the guy is free. And the other half, he doesn't keep for himself, doesn't keep ownership, but sells the other half or gives the other half as a gift to someone else. So in that case, even though the slave is still half free and half a slave, from the owner's perspective, the owner relinquished all of his ownership. Since the owner relinquished all of his ownership, everyone agrees, even the Rabbi Yehuda Nasi agrees that the transaction works and the slave acquires half of his freedom. That's Rabbah's basic principle. Okay, Amar le Abaye. Abaye is going to challenge it. It's going to be a complicated challenge because Abaye's challenge is the source of it is from two baraitot, and these two baraitot contradict each other. And one way that we're going to resolve the contradiction is to say that one is Rabbi and one is Rabbanan. And that will be a challenge to Rabbah. What we're about to see, I just want to show you the outline. We're going to present these two baraitot, and then we're going to have four different ways of reconciling these two. Okay, so let's see what Abaye says. Amar Abaye b'kolo lo pelige. Is that true that if the owner relinquishes all of his rights, then there's no machloket? But that doesn't seem to be right, because otherwise, how are you going to reconcile these two baraitot? והתנא חדה, הכותב נכסיו לשני עבדיו, קנו ומשחררים זה את זה. ותניא אידך, האומר, כל נכסי נתונים לפלוני, ופלוני עבדי, אף עצמם לא קנו. So the first braita says that someone who writes all of his property is giving over to his two slaves. It works. They acquire all the property, including themselves. And so therefore they free themselves, and now that they're free, they can own property. And so it works, and they will free each other. Basically, each one owns half of themselves and half of the other, and so they can get together and say, hey, I'll free your half, you free my half, and now they're totally free, and they split all of the assets. So according to the first braita, kanu, it works. But the second braita, which it's a slightly different formulation, but on the surface it seems to be the same, we're going to note a few subtle differences between the possible differences between them. The second one says, if some person, owner says, all of my property is given to this person and that person, my slaves, then they don't acquire anything. They don't acquire the property. They don't even acquire themselves. Apparently, because you cannot acquire half of it. You cannot acquire half freedom. And in this case, even though the owner is giving away everything. The owner keeps nothing. So both of these baraitot fit with the principle of nafik mine kule, and yet they contradict. So how are we going to resolve a contradiction between these two baraitot? So my love, ha'rabi, ha'rabanan. The easiest way is to say that the first baraita who says it works, that's the opinion of Rabbi, because Rabbi says a person an owner can make someone half free and half slave. And so it works. It works no matter what. It works whether he's giving away everything or whether he's giving away only half. The second one is Rabbanan, and Rabbanan would say, no, you cannot acquire half of a freedom, even if the owner gives away everything, and he's giving this slave half and that slave half, it doesn't work. A slave cannot acquire half of himself. And so it seems that Rabbanan would say it's no good no matter what, even if the owner gives away everything, and that is a challenge to Rabbah, right? Because otherwise, how else can you resolve the contradiction between these two? All right, so that is the challenge, and so now Rabbah has to find a different way to resolve these two baraitot, and so that's what we're going to see. 4 different ways of resolving these two baraitot. So here we go. Here's number 1. La idi v'idi Rabbanan hadamar kulo hadamar hasi hasi. In fact, both of these baraitot can be Rabbanan. Rabbanan say in general, if one master just frees half of his slave but keeps the other half, that's no good. But in these two cases, there is a difference, and both of them are Rabbanan. And the difference is that in the first baraita, he says, everything. I'm giving everything to both of you, right? Kind of like he's making his 2 slaves partners, and he's saying, I'm giving you both everything, and then you'll split it up. So that's fine, because he's giving away everything, and the slaves are acquiring everything. Then when they come to split it up, they're going to be like, okay, I get this half the field, you get that field, I get half of you. Wait, I don't want half of you. I free you, and you free me. So that's why that works, because the owner is giving away everything all at once. Whereas the second one is a case where he says half and half. And it doesn't say the word chatzi. In this part of the Braita, we're going to see that this Braita, the second one, has a continuation, a sefa. But even from the Resha, you can see that it says leploni ufloni, meaning he's not treating them as one unit, like a partner, like one partnership that has 2 people in it, but rather he says, I'm giving you half and I'm giving you half. In that case, that's more problematic, because to each person, to you, I'm giving half. Well, I'm only giving half, but according to Rabbanan, that doesn't work, right? Even though I am consecutively or at the same time also giving half to the other guy, but this is a violation of the principle that you can't make someone half free. So therefore, we see that Rabbah can indeed defend himself and say Rabbanan would agree that if you give all of the property away at once, then it works. That's the first baraita. But if you don't give all of your property away at once, but you give half to this and half to that, it's not giving it away all at once. It's 2 separate transactions. Even if it's simultaneous, it's still 2 separate transactions, and that's why it doesn't work. Okay, that's the first reconciliation. We're going to have a challenge to it, but we're going to answer the challenge. Turns out that the second baraita has a continuation. So the beginning says, if you give all of your nechasim to Ploni and Ploni, my slaves, then it doesn't work. They don't even acquire themselves. And the Sefa says, Ve'im amar chatzi chatzi lo kanu. And if he said, you get half and you get half of my property, then it doesn't work. It also doesn't work. Now, Miklal Deresha damar kulo. If the Sefa is a case where he said, you get half and you get half, then we can infer that the Resha is where he said everything. And then both the first baraita would be a case of everything, and the second baraita would be a case of everything. So then you can't make this distinction. And so we answer, Perush kab mefaresh, af atzman lo kanu, kesad kegon damar hasi hasi. In fact, we could say that in the second baraita, there's not a contrast between the Resha and Sefa. They're not talking about two different cases, but rather the Sefa is explaining the Resha. In the Resha, when he says Liploni uploni, and we said Lo Kanu, what we mean by that case is when he says you get half and you get half. That's why it does not work. Good. And we say, you know what? I can even prove that this is the best interpretation of the Braita. Because if you think that they're talking about two different cases, and the Resha is talking about a case where he said, where he says, I give away everything to both of you at once, and that doesn't work. So if that doesn't work, then all the more so when the owner gives it away piecemeal, half and half. Do you even have to bother mentioning it? That would be by kal vachomer. So you know what? This is actually a very good way of reading it, and so we're supporting Rabba's reading of these two baraitot, and so we actually have a proof for it against Abaye. And then we're going to say no, not necessarily. The baraita is actually ambiguous. You can read it another way also. You can read it as being two separate cases. If it's because of this proof, then you know what? I would not necessarily accept it, because Tana Sefa legalu yeresha could be talking about two different cases, and I still would mention both of them, and I would mention the case in the Sefa to reveal what the case is in the Resha. Shelo tomar Resha damar chasi chasi, aval amar kulo kanu Tana Sefa. So that you don't say the Resha is where you say is a case of Chatzi Chasi, and that's where it doesn't work because he's giving it away piecemeal. But if he gave away all of it at once, then it works. In other words, if I only had one clause, only the Resha, then I would think that it only applies to a half-half case. So that's why I actually do need the Sefa. And I need the Sefa to specify a case of Chatzi Chasi, so that I know that the Resha is talking about a case of Kulo. And so that I can learn that even in the case of Kulo, when he gives it away all at once, even so, it is not valid. So one could interpret this baraita as talking about two separate cases, and therefore it's not necessarily a proof. Although you could also read it as one case, and that's the way we would read it in order to defend Rabbah. All right, good. So now that's one way of answering of solving the problem. And now we have a second way. So again, we have two baraitot, and we want to try to resolve them because they seem to be talking about very similar cases. So the second way of resolving it, the second baraita that says it does not work, they do not acquire it. That's talking about when he uses only one document, and there's a principle. You can't use one document to free two slaves, right? Each slave requires their own get shichrur. And so that's why it doesn't work in that case. Whereas in the first baraita that it says it does work is when he's using two different documents. And he says here, you get half and free, and you are free and you get half. So that's why it works, because it's two documents. All right. Now, bishtar ehad, my iria chasi chasi. And now we ask, because remember, the second baraita had a sefa, and the sefa was talking about chasi chasi, and we already interpreted that as meaning like a commentary on the first. So we say, now we're asking, if there's only one, if the problem in the second baraita is that there's only one get shichrur, and you can't free two people with one get shichrur, then why do you have to bother saying that's a case when he said half and half, as if that's the problem that is piecemeal? Afilu amad kulo name lo kanu. Even if he said you get everything all at once, it also wouldn't be good because he's using one get shichrur for two people. So why would you bother bringing in an extra complication of chasi chasi when that's not the reason, right? No matter what, it's not going to work. And so we explain, we can actually read this answer into the Braita. Hachinami ka'amar. We're using, yes, indeed so. That is in fact what the Braita teaches. Af atzman lo kanu, they do not acquire themselves. That's when he uses only one shtad for two people. It's not going to work. But if he has two shtadot, then it will be fine. And the Sefa is adding one more different law that, by the way, if he frees them piecemeal, you get half and you get half, then even with two shtadot, it also won't won't work. So the Braita is teaching us both of these laws, in fact. Okay, so now we have two ways of resolving the Braita in a way that will support Rabbah against Abaye. And here now we have a third. This third one is going to be rejected, however. The third answer is that the first Braita is talking where that says it works. That's when he gives, he frees both of the slaves simultaneously. He says, you both get your freedom and you get all the property, and now, go ahead, go and split it. Because he does it simultaneously, so then that's good, because now they each get their halves, and then they can free each other. But the second Braita is when they do it one after the other. And so here's the problem. First I free slave A. When I free slave A, he's only half free, and the other slave is nothing. And so then when I do the other slave, then he's only half free. So it's not happening at the same time. All right. What really is happening here is that I'm going to slave A. He says, okay, you get all my property. Well, the second that happens, he can get everything, including slave B. But now slave B is going to be a slave to slave A. Right. And so this is not going to work. So now, so that's why it doesn't work. Now we ask about that. Now we understand why the second slave will not acquire his freedom, because the first slave already acquired the second slave. But the first slave should acquire everything, because if I said, hey, you get the slave A, you acquire your freedom and my property. And then I say to slave B, slave B, you acquire your freedom and my property. So the first one should work, because he's getting everything. So you're right, you know what, this answer is not going to work. So we're going to go back to one of the first two answers. Okay, so now we rejected the third one. Now we have the last answer, which is the first three are actually stam. The last one is named Rav Ashe Amar Shane Hatam Deka Kare Lehu Avadai. Rav Ashe says the problem in the second Braita is that he said the word Avadai. If we go back to look exactly at the language, you can see it. He says, Kol nechasai, all of my property is given to this person and this person, my slaves. In other words, he's still calling them slaves. Well, you can't free someone if you're still calling them slaves. That shows that you're not really freeing them. What you're trying to do is give your property to these two people, but you want them to remain slaves. But they can't. If they remain slaves, then they can't own their own property. You give something to a slave, it goes right back to the owner, right? And so by calling them slaves, he's showing he's not freeing them. That's the problem in the second Braita. The first Braita, he doesn't call them slaves. So the first Braita works because he's really freeing them. Good. That's Rav Ashe. Amar le Rav Ashe. V'dilma avadai sheyu kevad. Rav says to Rav Ashe, wait a second, that's not a problem. He's saying slaves that they had been slaves. He's referring to them, I give all my property to you and you, my slaves. He means that you had been my slaves, but now that I'm gifting to you all of my property, and within his property are the slaves themselves, so he's gifting to them, he's freeing the slaves and giving them their own freedom. And so that's not a problem that he's calling them slaves. He means in the past tense. And Rafram has a proof from a Mishnah in Pe'ah. Mila tenan. Hakotev kol nechasav le'avdo yasa leharut. Shi'er karka kol shehu lo yasa leharut. Someone writes that all my property should go to my slave. The slave goes free because the slave acquires all of his property. The slave himself is included in that property. And so simultaneously he acquires himself and all the rest of the property. That works. However, if the owner said, I give everything to my slave except for some piece of land, then it doesn't work, because he's retaining for himself some piece of land, and we suspect maybe he wants to retain for himself some a slave too to work on the land. And so if he's holding something back, then it doesn't work. That's according to Tanakama. Rabbi Shimon omer leolam hu ben horin ad sheyomar kol nechasai netunim leploni avdi chutz me'echad meribo shebahen. Rabbi Shimon says even that case that the Tanakama mentioned would work, because all he said was, I want to hold back some land. He didn't say I want to hold back any slaves. So he's giving away all of his property, including all of his slaves. If he's holding back a little land, the slave still goes free and gets all the rest of the land. Rabbi Shimon only says it doesn't work, right? So he'll be free unless the owner said, all of my property is given to this person, my slave. This is why I bring this, because he still calls him my slave, except for 1/10,000th of my property. He's not holding back land specifically. He's holding back some property, even though it's a small amount. But we don't know what part of the property. Does he want to keep a piece of land, a cow, a vase, a slave? We don't know. Since it could be that he wants to keep for himself the slave, therefore the slave does not go free. And since the slave is not free, he cannot acquire any part of the property. Okay, that's the Mishnah. Now we analyze the language that Rabbi Shimon quotes, Lifloni Avdi. So, and we see that Tama Da'amar Chutz Me'achad Ribo Shebehen. What is Rabbi Shimon's problem with this formula? The problem is that the master is holding back 1/10,000th of everything he's giving. And that could be that could be the slave himself. La Amar Hachi Kaneh. But if he didn't say that, if he said Ploni Avdi, and he left out the chutz, then Rabbi Shimon would agree that works. It's totally fine. But according to you, Rav Asher, you should object to this Mishnah and say, no, he's calling him my Eved, so that means he doesn't want to free him. But you're right, we see in the Mishnah, Rabbi Shimon doesn't say that. Evidently, Rabbi Shimon in this Mishnah has no problem with calling him a slave, because what he means is that I'm giving it to this person who up until now has been my slave, but now by giving him all my property, now he won't be my slave. And the same thing in the second Baraita. There's no problem that he's calling him his slave. What he means is actually to free him and say that you had been my slave, and therefore Rafram disagrees with Rav Asher's resolution to the two Baraitot. All right, that ends that discussion. Now we have a next discussion of damage that happens to someone who is half free and half slave, right? And even though we saw in the Mishnah that if someone is half free and half slave, we force, according to Bet Shammai, the person that's a half owner to free him, but until he does that, or according to Bet Hillel, before Bet Hillel changed his mind, so you still could have a situation of someone who's half free and half slave. And now what if that half guy is gored by an ox? Who collects the damages? Negaho shor, yom shel rabo lerabo, yom shel asmo leasmo. Okay, very convenient. We saw according to Bet Hillel that a half-free, half-slave person, one day he works for his master, Sunday he works for him, Monday he works for himself, Tuesday he works for master, Wednesday he works for himself. So it depends, when did the ox gore him, right? This is damages that happen, like on the job. So that's actually part of the income. Whoever owns a slave, let's just say a regular case of a slave, right? I own a slave, an ox comes and gores him. The payment goes to the owner. It's because this is property. The payment doesn't go to the slave. So therefore, if it happens to be on a day, Sunday, when the half-slave is working for his master and he's gored, then the owner of the ox will pay the master. If it's Monday and he's working for himself, so then that's like a free person who gets gored. He collects his own damages. Good. Ela me'ata yom shel rabo yisa shivcha yom shel asmo yisa bat horin. Now we challenge this statement. Wait a second. So now you want to tell me if in fact you treat him fully like a slave on one day and fully like a free person on another day, then why not say on a day that he's working for his master, so now he's treated fully like a slave on that day, let him marry a maidservant on that day, because he's a slave and he can marry a maidservant. And on the day that he's free, so now you're treating him as fully his own, so let him marry a bat chorin on that day, right? And that's going to be kind of confusing, right? What's he going to do with his wife the next day? So obviously this is preposterous. And so we should not treat the person as fully one and fully the other, but maybe they should split the fine, the damages. And so we answer, Isura la kamrina. No, this is, we're not talking about a prohibition. When we talk about monetary status, the monetary status can be split, all one day and all the other. You own yourself one day and you keep all your profits. You work for your master one day and he keeps all the profits. Damages are part of the profits that a master keeps, fully on that day, but not on another day. But regarding prohibitions, being prohibited to marry this one or that one, that applies all the time. and does not get split between one day and the other. And in fact, a half free, half slave person cannot marry a slave, cannot marry a free person. Okay. Tashema. Hemit mi shechasyo eved bechasyo ben horin noten hasi kenas lirabo vehasi kofer le yorshav. Now we're going to once again challenge this first statement and from the second statement here. If a ox comes and kills, not only damages, but kills someone who is half slave and half free, then the owner of the ox has to pay a fine, and he gives half of that fine, which is the entire fine is 30 shekel. It's a standard amount for an eved Kena'ani. So he gives half of the fine to the owner and half of the fine to the heirs of the eved Kena'ani. This eved is dead, so he's this half person is dead. So he's not going to get it. But it goes to his heirs instead. So what we see here is that we split the fine half and half. So we amai hachinam elema yom shel rabo lerabo yom shel asmo lasmo. Why don't you say the same thing as you did here in the case of damages? Depending on the day. On Sunday he's fully a slave. On Monday he's fully free. So we should see what day he killed by this shor on, and so then whatever day it was, if it was Sunday, then the owner should get all 30 shekel. If it was Monday, then the heir should get all 30 shekel. Why are you splitting it half in this case? And the answer is shanehacha deka kalya karna. No, in this case where the guy dies, that's different because the principal is consumed. In the case of damages, so he got a damage, he hurt his arm, and he'll get better, right? And so the principle is still there, but just there's damages. If the damages happened on the owner's watch, the owner gets it. If it happened on his own watch, then he gets it. But that's only temporary damage. In the case of when you killed the guy, so now he's gone forever, and the Sunday guy loses out, the Monday guy loses out, the owner loses totally. So you can't say, oh, it happened on Monday, so sorry owner, you don't get anything. Wait, you ruined my principle. I owned half of it, and you destroyed totally the principle of my half, so you have to pay me half. And for himself also, he's dead, but his heirs deserve to get the other half. Now the Gemara asks a question. Ve'ela hechidami de la ka kalya karna. What would be a case where the principle is not destroyed? In other words, this memra here, remember that we started off, this is not a braita that we start off with, but rather an Amoraic statement. So what would be a case that you would have to pay the master if it was his day, or himself if it was his day, if he was gored and damaged by an ox and the principle was not damaged, right? How would you have such a case? Okay, easy. If the ox gored, struck his hand, and his hand was injured, but it will get better, and so it's only temporary loss. So then that's what he would have to pay, and that would be a payment to the master if that was his day. All right, that works only. That would make sense according to Abaye, as opposed to Rava, as we'll see in a second. Abaye says that if there's an injury of an ox to a person, or an injury of any type of one to another, then he has to pay the shevet gedola and shevet ketana. This means the value of the loss of the value of that slave, and also the fact that he's not working during that time. Now, here's the thing: when a human injures a slave, then the payment has to be for both of those things. For the damage to the principal, that is now less, even if it's temporary, according to Abaye, right? Even though the person will get better, you still have to pay for the loss of the principal for that amount of time, and you also have to pay for the loss of work. And now this would make sense according to Abaye, because here's the thing: when it's an ox that damages someone, then you don't have to pay for the loss of shevet of not working, but rather only for the loss of principal. And Abaye says there is payment of loss of principal even for a temporary injury. So according to Abaye, we have a case that makes sense, that he has to pay the owner of the ox has to pay the owner of the slave for that temporary loss of that principle for that injury. However, Rava says that when someone injures a slave, then he does not pay, and it's a temporary injury, then he does not pay for the loss of principle, because after all, he's going to get better. So why do I have to pay for the loss of principle? Rather, I only have to pay for the loss of the livelihood of the work of each day that the slave can't work. But we have a principle that you only pay for the loss of livelihood if it's a human that injures a slave, but if it's an ox that injures a slave, then there's only payment for damage and not payment for day-to-day. And according to Rava, if there's a temporary injury, then there's no payment for damage. And so there will be no payment at all, according to Rava. So what case was that memra that we started with talking about? And we have two answers. Maybe it's talking about actually when a human struck him, even though the language of that memra was when an animal struck him. So we'll change the situation. For Rava would have to say, no, that only applies if it's a human that hits the slave and causes him temporary injury. So he will be healed. Therefore, according to Rava, there's no payment for principal, but he was out of work. So then he would have to pay for those days that he didn't work. And that payment, if it happened on a day when he was a servant, when he was supposed to serve his master, then the payment will go to the master. Or we can just answer even more simply that is not a baraita, it's a statement of an amora. Rava is also an amora. He could say, I don't agree with that halacha, right? So leave it as an ox, and the Rava will say, no, there's no payment there at all, so there's no problem. All right, good. Now we're leaving the topic of half slave, half free, to go back to the case where you have a slave who was freed monetarily but still has a prohibition. So it is also kind of a case of half free, half slave, but not that it's not that he's half owned and half not owned, but rather he is the master freed him monetarily by making him hefker, but still has to give him a get, and he can't yet marry, still has the prohibition upon him. So we're going to see a couple of questions about his exact status regarding damages and regarding teruma. So meukav get shichrur, yesh lo kenas o en lo kenas. If you have a servant who was freed monetarily, but he still is waiting to get his get shichrur, and should the someone kill that slave, an ox kill the slave, and so the Torah says you have to pay 30 shekel. This is a 30 shekel fine no matter what the value of the slave is. Who gets it, right? Does the payment go to the master or not? Does the master not get it? On the one hand, the master, he's still a slave because he doesn't have the get, but the master doesn't own him monetarily, so maybe he shouldn't get it. So that's the two sides of the question. Kesef shilashim shekalim yiten ladona. The pasuk says that 30 shekalim have to go to his master. Amar chamana v'haylav adon. Who do you say? Well, this is not the master because he is no longer owned monetarily. But since the owner, the master, still does have to give him a get shichrur, so he is called the master. This is a good question. We'll attempt two answers. Tashema hemit mi shechasyo aved vechasyo ben horin noten hasi kenas l'rabo vehasi kofer leyorshav. So remember this braita: if someone an ox killed someone who's half free and half slave, so he gives half the fine to the master, and half the fine goes to the heirs. And now, my love kamishna acharona. Right now, shouldn't we assume that this baraita is going by according to Bet Shammai and according to Bet Hillel after he changed his mind? Mishnah acharona meaning we're always going to follow Bet Hillel, but aren't we following Bet Hillel after he changed his mind? Now, Bet Hillel after he changed his mind, which is the same as Bet Shammai, says that the court forces the guy, the owner of half of the slave, to free him. Now, at that point that the court orders him, free him, that's the same as the slave being hefker. right? And he can't work him anymore. He doesn't own him anymore monetarily, but he still has to give him a get shechirur. So that opinion of Bet Shammai, which Bet Hillel eventually agrees with, is the same as our case of someone who is monetarily free, but still is waiting a get shechirur. And this Braita says that the owner gets the fine. Now, in this case, the owner only gets half the fine because he only owns half of him. But if he owned the whole thing, the whole slave, but was monetarily free, he would get the whole thing. So, isn't this a proof that the owner does collect the fine, even though he doesn't own him monetarily? And the answer is that's not necessarily a proof. La Mishnah Rishona, maybe this Braita is assuming the opinion of Bet Hillel before he changed his mind. And at that point, Bet Hillel says, work one day here and work one day there. And the owner, the master, has full ownership over him on those days. And so it does not have, that's full ownership, not on that day. On Sunday, it's full ownership and not including monetary ownership. And so therefore, that deserves the fine because of that. And we can't prove anything from this Baraita about a slave who is not monetarily owned, but waiting get shechrur. So no proof from there. Second attempt, Tashema, hipil et shino v'simeh et ayno, yoseh b'shino v'noten demeh ayno. We know that the Torah says that if a master knocks out his Eved Kena'ani's tooth or eye, then he goes free. Now, what if he does both? The owner knocked out the tooth and the eye of his servant. So when he knocked out his tooth, the slave goes free. Now he's a free person, and the eye he has to pay for. The owner, the now previous owner, has to pay the damages for the eye. That's what the Braita says. Let's analyze. V'yamat yesh lo kenas ukenas lerabo hashta chible be'acharine yahavi lerabeh chaval be'rabeh gufeh yaheb ledideh. For this proof to work, we are assuming that when the slave when he knocks out his tooth and he goes free only monetarily, but he still has to give a get. But we're going to discuss that assumption in a second. Okay, assuming that this case here of his knocking out the tooth, and then the owner has to further pay the former slave for his eye, and this is a case of where he is mechusar get. Now, let's look. We can have a kavachomet here. If you say up here, the answer to that question was that when the ox gores and kills a slave, then the payment goes to the master. The master who is only who doesn't have monetary but only is mechusar get. If you say that, it wouldn't make any sense, because here in this case where where someone in that case with the ox, where someone else gores the person, the master gets the fine. In this case where the master himself injured the slave, should the master have to pay the other guy? In other words, in the case of Ipilat Sheno, when the master himself is doing the injury, and we say the master has to pay the slave, even though he's still mechusar get, so, and the master has to pay him. So all the more so if the damage comes from a third party, someone else's ox, that that money should go to the slave or his heirs and not go to the master. And so this is a proof that an owner who does not have monetary ownership, but only is a mechusar get, should not be able to collect a fine. Okay, so this would be a good answer according to the assumption that we said, but Dilma Keman Damar Eno Sarich, but maybe in this case, the owner does not have to give a get shechrur. Once an owner knocks out the tooth of his Eved Kana'ani, the Eved Kana'ani goes free totally, monetarily and prohibition-wise. So if we follow that, then there is no proof. The Tanya, and now we see a Braita, that this is a major machloket. Bechulan Eved Yoseh Bahen lecharut v'sarich get shechrur merabot Rabbi Yishmael. According to Rabbi Yishmael, in all of them, so what we're learning now is that Eved Kenani goes free for tooth and eye. The Torah says those explicitly, but the rabbis derive that also for other limbs. A list of 24 different limbs that also, if the owner damages his slave also goes free. So now, according to the Bishmael, for all of them, for all 24, the slave goes free, and he needs a get shichurur from his master. That's a Bishmael. So according to that, would be a good proof. It would have been a good proof. Rabbi Meir Omer no sarich, but Rabbi Meir says he does not need a get. So that person, the status of this person, of this slave, is totally free. And that's why he collects. So it's not comparable to our case. Rabbi Eliezer Omer sarich, Rabbi Tarfon Omer no sarich, Rabbi Akiva Omer sarich. Right, so there's many opinions on this side and many opinions on that side. And so it would only be a proof according to half of them, not the other half. Now, what are we going to do for halacha? Machri'in lifnei chachamim omrim, those who actually have to make a decision and they're ruling before the sages, and they're going to find a compromise. And they say, Nir'im divrei Rabbi Tarfon b'shen ve'ayin. Rabbi Tarfon, who said you don't have to give a get, that's for Shen and Ayin. The Torah says explicitly they go free. That means they totally go free. Ho'il v'Torah ziketa lo. V'diber Rabbi Akiva b'shar evarim ho'il u'knas chachamim hu. For eye and tooth, since the Torah says you go free, so they get totally free and doesn't have to give a get. Whereas according to Rabbi Akiva, it makes sense, the opinion of Rabbi Akiva, that he has to give a get, that would make sense in the other limbs, since that's a fine of the sages, not in the Torah itself. Now we ask about that. Kenas, you're calling that a fine of the sages? We learned it from a derasha of a pasuk, so it still should be a deoraita, not just a drabanan. We're learning it from a pasuk, so it still should have deoraita status. Okay, rather what we meant to say, not that knas chachamim, that the rabbis made it up, but rather it's a midrash chachamim, and there is a difference of authority between something that the Torah says explicitly and something that's learned from a midrash halacha. This is a really important statement about what is the status in general of a midrash halacha. And we see here that it does, in fact, make a difference, even though they're both still will be called deoraita. Both are called deoraita, but still they have different values. Shen and ayin that are said explicitly in Torah, if the master knocks those out, goes free totally, because everybody knows that Shen and Ayin they go free, and so everybody say, oh look, what happened to your tooth? Your master knocked it out. Oh, you're totally free. Everybody knows that. But for the other ones, which is based on Midrash Shachamim, it's not so explicit. Not everybody knows every Midrash. So there, the master would be required to give a get shichrur in addition, and not when he knocks out his hand, then he goes free monetarily, but still has to give a get shichrur. So bottom line for us, according to this compromise position, is that the case here that we brought as proof was about Shen v'ayin, and so according to the Divrei HaMachri'in, the compromise, they say Shen v'ayin, you don't need a get at all. Since you don't need a get at all, this person does not have a status of anything in between. He's totally free. Since he's totally free, once the master knocks out his tooth, that's why the master has to pay the slave for his eye. But we can't learn anything from here regarding the mechusar get, whether that fine goes to the master or not. All right, and last question. We know that a kohen can eat teruma, and so can his wife, even if she is a bat Yisrael, and so can all of his slaves and servants. They can all eat teruma. But what if the kohen owns a slave, but then does not have monetary ownership over the slave, but is still didn't get a get shichrur? So he's like half a status of a slave. Can that slave continue to eat teruma under the ownership of the master, or since he's not monetarily owned, he can't? Here's the two sides. Kinyan kaspo amar Chaman. Pasuk says that anyone who is kinyan kaspo, the owned monetarily by the master, can eat teruma. V'hailav kinyan kaspohu, but this person, this slave who is no longer owned monetarily, is not kinyan kaspo and therefore cannot eat teruma. Or do we say, since the owner still has to give a get to the slave, so the slave is still under the authority of the master, and therefore can eat teruma. So here we'll attempt an answer. Tashema damarav misharshiya kohenet shenit arev velada bevlad shifchata. An interesting case of a bat Yisrael who's married to a kohen who has a baby. At the same time, she also has a maidservant who also has a baby, and the babies get mixed up. So one of these babies is a free person who is the son of a kohen and keni teruma. One of them is a slave, but is owned by a kohen. But we don't know which one is which. Now we say hare elu ochlin bitruma. Both of them keni teruma. Why not? One is they're both in the household of a kohen, so that's fine. Vecholkin chelek echad al hagoren. When they go to collect teruma, they only deserve one portion altogether. So they actually have to go together. A slave is not allowed to go to the threshing floor alone to collect the portion on behalf of the household. He has to go together with the actual kohen. But they can go together to collect it, so they get one portion for both of them. So it doesn't matter which one's which, as long as they go together, that's fine. But here's what's interesting: when they get older, they have to free each other. We don't know which one is the slave and which one is the owner. So when they get older, right, eventually the father will die, and the son will inherit. Now, we don't know which one is the actual son, but one of these two is the son that inherits the other one who's a slave. So one of these owns the other. Now, what do we see from here? That even though one owns the other, he can't work the other because we don't know which one is which, right? Each one will say, no, I own you. They will say, I own you. So basically, they have no monetary ownership over each other. Because monetary ownership would come with the ability to work them. Yet, even though there's no monetary ownership, they can still continue to eat teruma. So this is a good proof, right? We say wrong. Hachi hashta hatamim yavo Eliyahu yomar bechad minayu da'aved hu kinyan kaspo karina be hachalav kinyan kaspo hu kelal. No, it's not the same, because in this case where the kids get switched, we are in doubt. But if Eliyahu Navi would come, or if someone would suddenly discover a DNA testing, then we would know which one of them is 100% a slave and is fully owned by the other. We just happen to not know which one is which. But it doesn't matter, right? One way or another, one of these people is fully owned by the other. We just don't know which. That's why we can't make them work. That is, but our case that we were asking about is when a master makes hefked his slave and is not owned by him at all. That's where the question is, and therefore we do not have a proof from this baraita. Baruch Adonai Leolam, Amen ve'amen.